Imagine marching towards certain victory only to face a nightmare so calculated it sends an empire fleeing. They say the screams carry it for miles. It's the summer of 1462. You're an Ottoman soldier in the mightiest army on earth, conqueror of Constantinople, crusher of empires. You're marching into the small principality of Wallachia to put down a rebel prince. It should take days, maybe weeks. Then you smell it. Death, rot, something you can't name. The column slows, scouts freeze. You crest a hill near the capital and see it. A forest. But the trees aren't trees, they're people. 20,000 of them. Your comrades raised on wooden stakes in perfect geometric rows. Some dead for weeks, bloated and dark. Others still alive, still moving, still screaming. Your sultan, the man who broke the Byzantine Empire, takes one look and orders the entire army to turn back. What kind of mind creates something like this? And here's the part that truly terrifies you. It wasn't madness. It was strategy. Cold, deliberate, and brutally effective. The story you think you know about Vlad the Impaler, it's a lie. Not because it didn't happen, but because the truth is so much worse. This is the full account of how one man weaponized human suffering so effectively that it changed the course of empires. And by the end, you'll understand why the real horror wasn't what he did to bodies, it was what he did to minds. Let's start with a question nobody asks. What breaks a human being so completely that they become capable of this? The year is 1442. Vlad is 11 years old. His father, Vlad II Dral, Vlad the Dragon, has just made a deal with the devil. Not a metaphorical one, a real one with a name. Sultan Murad II of the Ottoman Empire. The deal is simple. Vlad II gets to keep his throne in Leia. In exchange, he hands over his two youngest sons as hostages, insurance living collateral to guarantee his loyalty. So young Vlad and his brother Radu are torn from their home and delivered into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Not as prisoners in dungeons, but as guests in the palace at Idun, and later Agrias. They're given fine clothes, education, military training. They're taught Turkish, Arabic, philosophy, and the Quran. On the surface, it looks like privilege. But here's what the history books gloss over. This wasn't education. It was psychological warfare. Vlad spent his formative years, 11 to 17, watching his captors perfect the art of empire building. He studied how the Ottomans used fear as a governing tool. He witnessed public executions designed not just to punish, but to traumatize entire populations into submission. He learned that terror, when applied with surgical precision, was more effective than any army. And he learned something else. He was utterly powerless. While his younger brother Radu adapted, even forming a close friendship with the Sultan's son, Mehmed, Vlad refused to bend. According to Ottoman court records, he was frequently punished for his defiance. Some accounts suggest he was beaten, possibly tortured. The exact details are lost to history, but what's certain is this: something fundamental broke inside him during those years. Or perhaps more accurately, something crystallized. He developed what modern psychologists might call a persecution complex, combined with an obsessive need for control, but he channeled it. Every punishment he endured, he studied. Every torture technique he witnessed, he memorized. He was building a mental arsenal, piece by piece. In 1448, after 6 years of captivity, Vlad finally returned to Wallachia. He was 17 years old. 2 months later, his father was assassinated by rival boyars, the nobility who played both sides between the Ottomans and Hungarians. His older brother, Mitya, was buried alive. Vlad was alone, surrounded by enemies, backed by nobody. And here's where the story gets interesting. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted to remake the world in the image of his trauma. He would take everything the Ottomans had taught him about terror and refine it into something they had never seen before. But first, he had to wait. For 6 more years, Vlad lived in exile, plotting, planning, studying military tactics and political maneuvering. And in 1456, with Hungarian backing, he finally seized the Wallachian throne. The monster was about to be born. If you're fascinated by the documented psychological breaking points that created history's most notorious figures, hit subscribe. We're just getting started with how this broken boy became something far worse than his captors ever imagined. Vlad's coronation feast in 1456 should have been a celebration. Instead, it became the blueprint for everything that followed. He invited the boy families, the same nobility who had orchestrated his father's murder and buried his brother alive. Hundreds of them arrived in their finest clothes, believing they were there to pledge loyalty to the new prince. The great hall was decorated. Wine flowed freely. Then in the middle of the feast, Vlad stood up and asked a simple question. How many princes of Wallachia have you lived through? The older boy proudly answered, 710. Some claimed to remember a dozen different rulers. They were bragging about their survival, their political savvy, their ability to outlast any prince who sat on the throne. Vlad smiled, then he gave an order. Every boy who had answered was arrested on the spot, but here's where you see the methodical mind at work. He didn't execute them. Not yet. Instead, he separated them into two groups based on age and health. The older ones, the architects of his family's destruction. They were impaled immediately outside the palace walls. Not quickly. The stakes were carefully inserted to avoid vital organs, ensuring they would die slowly over hours or days. Their screams provided the soundtrack for what came next. The younger, stronger boyars and their families were stripped of their noble clothes and forced marched 50 miles north to the ruins of Panari Castle. There they were given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Rebuild the fortress with their bare hands or die. For months they hauled stones up the mountainside. They worked until their hands bled, until their fine clothes rotted off their bodies, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Most died during the construction. The survivors, they were never the same. Vlad had effectively erased the old nobility and replaced them with a new class who owed everything to him and lived in absolute terror of his displeasure. This wasn't just revenge. It was a systematic dismantling of the power structure that had made Wallachia weak. And it revealed something crucial about Vlad's psychology. He didn't just want obedience. He wanted to break people so completely that obedience became their only possible response. But this was still domestic politics. The boy were Walayan. What Vlad did next would send shockwaves across empires. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same Mehmed who had been Vlad's childhood companion, sent envoys to Wallachia demanding the annual tribute that Vlad's father had agreed to pay. The demand came with an additional insult. Vlad was to present himself personally in Constantinople to renew his oath of vassalage. The envoys arrived expecting the usual political theater, perhaps some negotiation, maybe a counteroffer. What they got was a preview of hell. When they entered Vlad's court and refused to remove their turbans, a genuine religious custom in Ottoman protocol, Vlad asked them to explain their tradition. They did, probably relieved that he seemed interested in understanding rather than offended. Vlad nodded thoughtfully. Then he said something that must have frozen their blood. I respect a man who honors his faith so completely. Let me help you honor it forever. He ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly to their skulls. Think about the precision of that cruelty. He didn't kill them. He mutilated them in a way that was both symbolically loaded and medically calculated to ensure they'd survive the journey back to Constantinople. They were walking messages, their screams echoing across the countryside as they fled back to the Sultan. When Mehmed received his envoys, these men he'd sent in good faith, now permanently disfigured and driven half-mad by pain, he understood immediately this wasn't the childhood friend he remembered. This was something new, something that had taken the Ottoman lessons in terror and evolved them into something even the Ottomans hadn't imagined. War was now inevitable. But before that war came, Vlad had more messages to send. Here's what most people don't understand about impalement. It wasn't just execution, it was engineering. The common image, a stake driven straight through the torso, would kill almost instantly. That defeats the entire purpose. Vlad's method was far more sophisticated and infinitely more cruel. Based on contemporary medical analyses of the descriptions in surviving Ottoman accounts, here's how it actually worked. First, the victim was laid face down. The stake, carefully selected, rounded at the tip and thoroughly oiled, was inserted through the rectum. But here's the crucial detail. It was inserted at an angle specifically designed to miss all major organs and blood vessels. The victim was then slowly raised upright, and gravity did the rest. Over the course of hours or sometimes days, their own body weight would force the stake gradually upward through their torso. The path was calculated to avoid the heart, lungs, and major arteries. In some documented cases, the stake would eventually emerge through the shoulder or chest, but the victim could remain alive for up to 3 days. Why this method? Because Vlad understood something that modern psychological warfare experts now confirm. Witnessing prolonged suffering is exponentially more traumatizing than witnessing quick death. A battlefield beheading is horrific but brief. Impalement was a performance that lasted days, complete with screams that could be heard across entire valleys. But the physical act was only one component. The real genius, if we can use such a perverted word, was in the staging. When Vlad impaled victims, he did it in public squares along major roads, outside city gates, anywhere that would maximize visibility. He understood that word of mouth and rumor would multiply the psychological impact far beyond the actual number of victims. One impalement witnessed by 100 people would create 100 storytellers, each of whom would tell 100 more. And he refined the symbolism constantly. Stakes were different heights based on rank. Peasants near the ground, nobles higher, the highest reserved for enemy commanders. This created a grotesque visual hierarchy that reinforced his message. Everyone has a place in my world, and everyone will suffer according to their station. In some accounts, he arranged impaled victims in geometric patterns, circles, stars, concentric rings. This wasn't random sadism, it was a demonstration of control. It said, I have so much power that I can turn human suffering into art. There's a German pamphlet from 1462, admittedly propaganda, but based on eyewitness accounts from Saxon merchants in Wallachia, that describes Vlad dining among the impaled. He allegedly had a table set up in the middle of a field of stakes, ate his meals surrounded by dying men, and seemed to enjoy the experience. Whether this specific incident happened exactly as described is debatable. But what's not debatable is the psychological message. I am so far beyond your understanding of human behavior that your horror doesn't touch me. The Saxons, who had their own complicated relationship with Vlad, circulated these pamphlets widely. They were some of the first mass-produced horror stories in European history, complete with woodcut illustrations. These images, crude but effective, spread across Europe and cemented Vlad's reputation. But here's the question nobody was asking. Was any of this working? Was terror actually an effective military strategy? Or was Vlad just a sadist with power? The answer came in the summer of 1462, and it would prove that Vlad's methods weren't just effective, they were devastatingly so. Sultan Mehmed II had finally had enough. By early 1462, Vlad had not only refused to pay tribute, but had launched raids deep into Ottoman territory south of the Danube. In one particularly brutal campaign, he crossed into Ottoman lands with a small force and, according to his own letter to the Hungarian king, killed over 23,000 people. He even kept a body count, categorizing victims by age and gender. Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople at age 21, who had crushed rebellion after rebellion, who commanded the most powerful military machine on earth, decided to personally handle the Wallachian problem. In the spring of 1462, he assembled an army estimated between 60,000 and 90,000 men. The exact number is lost to history, but even conservative estimates put it at more than triple Wallach's entire military-age male population. This wasn't an invasion, it was an extermination. Vlad had maybe 20,000 to 30,000 men total, many of them peasant conscripts with minimal training. A conventional battle would be a massacre. So Vlad did what he'd been planning since childhood. He refused to give them a conventional battle. As the Ottoman army entered Wallachia, they found nothing. Empty villages, poisoned wells, burned fields. Every potential source of food and water had been systematically destroyed. Vlad had ordered his own people to abandon their homes and retreat into the forests and mountains, taking their livestock with them. The Ottoman supply lines stretched longer and longer, and then the night's raids began. These weren't typical skirmishes. Vlad had trained specialized units in guerrilla warfare. Small groups of men, maybe 50 to 100, would strike Ottoman camps in the dead of night, killing sentries, setting fires, and disappearing before any organized response could form. They targeted supply wagons, pack animals, ammunition stores. The goal wasn't to defeat the army, it was to make them paranoid, exhausted, and demoralized. But the masterpiece came on the night of June 17, 1462. Vlad had learned from captured Ottoman soldiers that Sultan Mehmed himself was camped near Targovica with his personal guard, the elite Janissaries. This was an opportunity that would never come again. Vlad personally led a force of about 10,000 men in what became known as the night attack. Under cover of darkness, they infiltrated the massive Ottoman camp with one objective: kill the Sultan. Contemporary accounts describe absolute chaos. The Wakians were dressed in captured Ottoman uniforms and knew enough Turkish to cause confusion. They set fire to tents, stampeded horses, and specifically targeted the section of camp where the Sultan's pavilion stood. They came within yards of Mehmed himself. Some historians believe Vlad and the Sultan were briefly in visual contact across the burning camp, but the Janissaries held, forming a defensive circle around their leader. After hours of close-quarters combat, Vlad realized he couldn't break through. He ordered a retreat, and his men vanished back into the night as suddenly as they had appeared. The Ottoman casualties were relatively light, maybe 2,000 killed, though Ottoman sources downplay the numbers. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, in the middle of his own army, had nearly been killed by a vastly outnumbered enemy who struck from nowhere and disappeared like ghosts. Mehmed's commanders were rattled. His soldiers were exhausted, and they were still weeks away from Constantinople, marching through a dead landscape where every shadow might hide an enemy. Then they reached the capital, and they saw what Vlad had been preparing for them. No written description can fully capture what Mehmed's army encountered on the approach to Targovica in late June 1462. But we can try. Imagine you're an Ottoman soldier. You've been marching for weeks through scorched earth. You're hungry, exhausted, and jumpy from constant night raids. You haven't seen the enemy in days. They've just vanished. That should be a good sign. It feels like a trap. As you approach the Wakian capital, the smell hits first. If you've ever smelled a dead animal rotting in summer heat, multiply that by thousands. Then add the sweet, sick-making odor of decomposing human flesh. It's so thick you can taste it. Then you see the stakes. The first one, then 10, then 100. Then you realize there is no end. They stretch to the horizon in every direction. Contemporary accounts say the field of impaled bodies extended for nearly 2 miles in length and over half a mile in width. Modern historians debate the exact number. Ottoman sources, probably minimizing for propaganda reasons, claim 10,000. Wakian and Hungarian sources claim up to 20,000. The truth is probably somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 impaled bodies. But here's what makes your skin crawl. This wasn't random. The stakes were arranged in precise geometric patterns, concentric circles radiating out from the capital height ordered rows. In some sections, they formed star patterns visible from elevated ground. Vlad had spent weeks, possibly months, preparing this. He'd captured Ottoman soldiers and sympathizers from earlier raids and border skirmishes. He'd kept them alive specifically for this purpose. Some of the bodies had been dead for weeks, rotting in the summer heat. Others had been impaled more recently, and some, according to multiple sources, were still alive. The Byzantine chronicler Leonikos Chalkondylas, who interviewed eyewitnesses, wrote that the moaning of the dying could be heard across the entire field. Some had been impaled for days, their bodies slowly consuming themselves, too weak to scream but still conscious. The Ottoman troops, hardened veterans who had conquered cities and slaughtered countless enemies, reportedly began vomiting. Some refused to advance further. Others started deserting in the night, willing to risk execution rather than continue through this nightmare. And at the center, on the tallest stake of all, was Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman commander captured in an earlier skirmish. His body, dressed in the remnants of his military finery, was positioned directly facing the road of the Sultan's approach. A personal message from Vlad to Mehmed. "This is what I do to your best men. Imagine what I'll do to you." Sultan Mehmed II, remember, this is the man who watched Constantinople's walls crumble under his cannons, who had ordered his own share of executions and massacres, reportedly stopped his horse and stared in silence for several minutes. Different sources record different versions of his response, but the most widely accepted comes from Chalka Kandel. It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who has done such great deeds, Who knows how to put his power to such use? A man who had done such things was worth much. This wasn't praise, it was recognition. The Sultan was acknowledging that he was facing something he didn't fully understand, a mind that had taken Ottoman methods and evolved them into something even the Ottomans couldn't match. The military situation was already deteriorating. Supply lines were overstretched. The scorched earth tactics had worked. The night raids had destroyed morale. The Sultan's own commanders were advising retreat. But the forest of the Impaled was the psychological breaking point. It proved that conventional military thinking didn't apply here. Vlad wasn't trying to win battles. He was trying to break minds. And it was working. Within days, Mehmed ordered a general retreat. He left a contingent under Vlad's younger brother, Radu, to continue harassing Vlad. But the Sultan himself withdrew with the main army. The most powerful military force in the world had invaded a tiny principality with overwhelming numbers and been turned back not by military defeat, but by sheer psychological warfare. Vlad the Impaler had won. But the story doesn't end there, because what comes next reveals the ultimate tragedy. That terror, however effective in the short term, always devours its wielder in the end. You'd think that turning back the Ottoman Empire would make Vlad a hero in Christian Europe. In some ways it did. The Hungarian king and the Pope praised his defense of Christendom. But here's what they didn't understand. Vlad couldn't turn it off. The methods that defeated the Ottomans didn't stop with the Ottomans. He used them on everyone. By late 1462, Vlad was impaling Lycian merchants for price gouging. He was impaling boyars suspected of disloyalty based on rumors. He was impaling entire villages for minor infractions. The tool he'd forged to defeat a superior enemy had become his only tool for everything. His political position deteriorated rapidly. His brother Radu, backed by Ottoman gold and soldiers, positioned himself as the sane alternative. Hungarian support evaporated as Vlad's increasingly erratic behavior alienated his allies. By November 1462, just months after his greatest triumph, Vlad was forced to flee into Hungarian territory. And here's the bitter irony. He was imprisoned by his supposed ally, King Mahavius Corvinus of Hungary, on charges that remain murky to this day. Some sources say Matthias fabricated letters to make Vlad look like he was negotiating with the Ottomans. Others suggest Vlad had become such a liability that even his Christian allies wanted him gone. He spent 12 years in Hungarian captivity, not the brutal imprisonment of his Ottoman youth, but house arrest in comfortable quarters. He even married a Hungarian noblewoman and had children. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner, but in 1476, opportunity returned. Wallachia had devolved into chaos under a series of weak rulers. Malavia's prince, Stephen the Great, helped orchestrate Vlad's return to the throne, backed by Hungarian and Malavian troops. Vlad reclaimed his throne in November 1476. He had maybe 2 months to rule. In December 1476 or January 1477, the exact date is lost. Vlad was killed in battle against an Ottoman force near Bucharest. The circumstances are murky. Some sources say he was killed by his own men, either through treachery or because they mistook him for an enemy in the chaos. Others say he was overwhelmed by Ottoman soldiers. What's certain is the aftermath. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof of death. After everything, the terror, the impalement, the psychological warfare, Vlad ended up as a trophy displayed for mockery in the capital of the very empire he'd fought his entire life. His body was allegedly buried at Snagov Monastery on an island in Romania. Excavations in the 1930s found a tomb, but it was empty. To this day, no one knows where Vlad's actual remains are. So what do we do with this story? In Romania, Vlad is often celebrated as a national hero, a brutal but effective leader who stood against overwhelming odds and preserved independence. There are statues of him. His face appears on tourist merchandise. To the rest of the world, especially after Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula loosely borrowed his name in history. Vlad became synonymous with vampirism and supernatural evil, which in a perverse way lets us off the hook. It's easier to think of him as a monster, something inhuman, than to confront the real horror. Because the real horror is this. Everything Vlad did was human, painfully, terrifyingly human. He wasn't born a monster. He was created by a system that taught him that power comes through terror. that survival requires absolute ruthlessness, that empathy is weakness. And he took those lessons and refined them to their logical extreme. The forest of the impaled wasn't madness, it was applied psychology. The night attacks weren't random bursts of violence, they were precision strategy. Every impalement, every display of suffering was a deliberate move in a larger plan. And here's the part that should unsettle you. It worked. Against impossible odds, using terror as a weapon, Vlad forced an empire to retreat. He showed that fear, when engineered with intent, can achieve what sheer military strength cannot. The question isn't whether he was evil, that's clear. The real question is what it says about us that this method was so effective, and what other calculated horrors lie buried in history's shadows, waiting to reveal lessons we'd rather avoid. If you want to keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths textbooks gloss over, subscribe. History's darkest chapters aren't just about what happened, they're about why it worked, and that's the knowledge we can't afford to forget.